For the Los Angeles Review of Books, I'm Colin Marshall, coming to you from deep in the bowels of the Barnes & Noble here at the Grove in Los Angeles, California, where I'm speaking with Edan Lepucki. She is a staff writer at the literary site The Millions, which I'm sure most or all of you have probably read before. She is the founder of Writing Workshops Los Angeles, and she's the author of a brand new novel getting much press called California. In the world of California, Edan, what has become of the Grove, where we're sitting now?
Oh, I ruined the Grove in the name of art.
Yes.
In the very
As
first,
many have wished to.
Yes, right. In the very first chapter, Frida, the wife, she and her husband Cal have left LA and are living in the wilderness. And she's thinking about this turkey baster that is a hoarded possession of hers that nobody knows she has. And she bought it at the Grove, and she's thinking about how the store that she bought it from was going out of business. And she kind of imagines the Grove earning back its name and having orange groves grow over the closed stores. And she imagines, I had a lot of fun writing this. She imagines like the fountain, like, I think like dried up, and the trolley bell looted from the trolley. And I just had a delightful time doing that because I hate the Grove and also kind of love to hate the Grove and hate to love it, which I think most Angelinos feel about it.
And you suspect they knew that would happen when they built it.
Yeah, right? They knew that we would come here in droves, like cursing that we were here, but still keep coming back.
So, listeners, you'll have guessed in this novel, California, something has happened that makes this world quite a bit different from the world we live in. It's been talked about, California has, as a post-apocalyptic novel, but it's not like the sort of Cormac McCarthy white flash and society is destroyed. This is a novel of, I would say, gradual apocalypse. I mean, do you consider that to be a tradition, a literature of gradual apocalypse? Yeah,
I mean, I suppose, I am the first to admit that I don't read a lot of apocalyptic novels, that when I started this, I had read some, like The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood is one of my favorite novels, and I read The Road, obviously, which I really liked. But I hadn't read that many, and so I was sort of ignorant of the tradition, but that, I think, helped me write the book, and that I didn't feel the weight of that tradition on my shoulders as I was working. And what's pointed out to me often now is that what is different about my book is that it's not a singular event as it is in The Road, for instance. It's actually just a kind of a slow accrual of horrible things happening, which are present in our contemporary world. Things like climate change and the effects of climate change, oil prices, and there's giant earthquakes that kind of wreck California, and snowstorms in the Midwest that decimate whole cities. And I didn't want to make it a singular event because I don't think that's actually as scary as just taking our world and placing us on a trajectory towards ruin, because that feels realistic. If we keep going in the way that we're going, we very well may end up like Frida and Cal. So I kind of like people sometimes say gradual or mid-apocalyptic or slow apocalypse. I kind of like those terms better because they're sort of in it. It's not really the post-apocalypse. Right. And it's sort of like life sucks and it just keeps going. It's a real uplifting book.
Sure. I mean, in a way, you've found a way to write a post-apocalyptic novel after the Cold War, because during the Cold War, we could have said that same thing. If we keep going the way we're going, suddenly there will be an event that destroys everything. There will be global thermonuclear war. We still have a nuclear threat, but people don't seem to really think about it in the same way they did 20, 30, 40 years ago. Now, of course, I mean, this is kind of every era getting the apocalyptic literature it deserves, right? Now we think about, I don't know, I mean, people, in a way, every generation kind of wants to selfishly be the one to witness the end of society on some level. But, people write about this all the time. They'll say, look at the natural disasters across the world. Look at global warming. Look at banking crises. Look at fighting in Gaza. It's like a lot of scattershot things that to them add up to being the end of the world. I don't know. I mean, I can understand that there's a lot of sucky stuff happening in the world, but how do people make the leap to, this is going to be it? This is going to be all this stuff happening is going to cohere in an unprecedentedly disastrous way. Do you know what I mean?
I know, exactly. And I think every generation has decided that something that just passed was the best and now it's getting worse. And I think there is some hubris involved in thinking that you are going to face the end. But I think ever since, we could go back to the fall from the Garden of Eden as sort of the first apocalypse that we have to function in. I do wonder if the speed of technology and the way that we find out about world events is speeding up our understanding of the world's demise. So I think there's always been conflicts across the globe, and there's always been illness and everything bad has always sort of been there before. And that's a really broad statement, but nowadays we hear about it constantly. And I think that's really overwhelming for people. And so I think we tend to think that catastrophe is not imminent. It's actually occurring right now because that we see we see the social media feeds where we see all these horrible things happening, and we can refresh it and something newly horrible has occurred.
And horrible gets clicks ultimately.
Right? Horrible and cute animals, yes, I think, right?
Yeah, exactly. Poles of the internet.
Yes.
And thus of humanity.
Yes, of course. I mean, it is interesting to me because I do feel like before I had a child, and even now that I have a child, I was very anxious about where the world was headed, just like probably every parent or parent-to-be or just any person. But I also recognize that that's kind of a human impulse to feel that there's sort of a darkness coming. So I don't know. I guess I always struggle with thinking like, oh, it really is horrible, but then also thinking about the great leaps and bounds that we've made as a species and, as a country, and the progress that we've made for, human rights in the last 100 years is really, beautiful. And so, and also faced with just on a daily basis with people who are very affectionate and tender and giving and compassionate. And so thinking about, human beings are like that. And we also have, the capacity for violence as well. So I kind of feel that tension in my own life on a personal level all the time.
And in writing if we're continuing using the term post-apocalyptic novel, writing that, it's a chance for you to, it seems like it's almost a pure narrative form, because you can make the reader believe something big has happened. You don't reveal what it is right away, but then you can slowly drip feed them the information like, bam, here's some new revelatory fact about how bad the world has got. Yeah. Slowly you can explain why. Bam, here's another fact. I mean, it's almost like this archetypal narrative form you get to use because it's post-apocalyptic, right? Everything has changed, and you can decide how to dole out how much to reveal, when to reveal, the extent of the change, right?
Yeah, I mean, I always say that novel writing, for me, the experience of novel writing is the main aesthetic question in any, I mean, there are other questions craft-wise that when you're working on any book, and they're always different, but it seems to me this is the first novel I've published, the second one I've ever written, and I'm now writing a third. But the question is always, when do you provide information and when do you withhold it? So, Margaret Atwood says that writing as a novelist, you have to be a burlesque dancer. Like, you don't want to take off your clothes too fast because then the show will be over. But if you take off your clothes too slow, then you're going to bore the audience.
You can't say, hey, here's what happened to the world, and then tell the story. That's not right.
You have to tease it a little bit, right? You have to show a little wrist and then, go from there. So I thought about that a lot, and it is really writ large in a book where some of the suspense is created by the reader wanting to know how the world ended up as it did. So it's the stakes are bigger, and it's kind of exciting as a writer to think about how that exposition is really appealing to the reader in a way that maybe it's not, I mean, it's even more appealing than it usually is for a reader. So, I mean, on the one hand, I really love doing that, but it was also difficult to figure out, I would just be writing a scene, and then, in the very first scene when Frida is thinking about getting the turkey baster, or how she had bought it at it's Crate and Barrel. Yes. She doesn't say, but she buys it at Crate and Barrel, and she thinks about how she had to buy it.
Held that.
I did, because there's also, I forgot there's Sur La Table, so it's the real question of my book. Is it Crate and Barrel or Sur La Table? I'm telling you now, it's Crate and Barrel. But she thinks about,
only hear it here. Listen.
Right. But she thinks about how she had to buy it with gold, and the gold had to be melted down already. And I sort of just wrote that in the moment. But as soon as I wrote it, I had a little ping of, I'm actually discovering the world as I'm writing the book. And so it was, my experience as the writer mirrored what I hope is the reader's experience of, as you move forward in the book, you hear about more and more of what has happened. And it was pretty thrilling to kind of get those things just kind of organically arriving in the text. And then other moments where I felt like, okay, now, Frida's thinking about her brother, or Cal's thinking about Frida's brother, and Micah, the brother, was a suicide bomber at the Hollywood and Highland Mall, another mall in LA.
Another one gleefully destroyed.
Yes, that one much more gleefully. It's a horrible mall, worse than any other mall in LA, I think. But, in those sections, really recognizing, okay, this is where I'm going to provide some longer swaths of information about what happened, and trying to balance those with the present. Like, that was a real technical challenge that I wasn't used to, because I haven't done this kind of world building in any of my other fiction.
This central couple, Frida and Cal, they have memories of their childhoods, which lead me to suspect that this novel is farther in the future than a reader would immediately assume, because it seems like some of the characters, they think back to childhood, but they're in their mid to late 20s, and their childhood memories seem like they're still the future compared to us right now. How much do we know about how far ahead the action is of this book?
The exact date I'm not going to remember. It's in the 2050s. I don't remember if it's 2057 or 2053. Sure. But it's funny is that
scale ahead it is.
Yeah. So it's about 30 years from now. So when they were children, I mean, it's still in the future, but I think what's interesting to me is, like, I wanted the world that they left to feel very similar to ours in a lot of ways. Like, they have technology, they use these devices, and she's a blogger, she's blogged before, but I didn't want it to feel super, a large leap forward in time. I didn't want it to feel that different. But
they don't remember flying cars or whatever.
Exactly. Which is, I'm still waiting for that damn flying car.
I'd rather they didn't show up, to be honest.
I know. But I wanted it to feel closer, and yet when you do get their childhood, it doesn't feel like our present day. But you don't, and what's funny is when I finished the book and sold it, my editor was like, can I see a timeline of what dates things happened? And I sort of laughed. I was like, what's a timeline? Why would one need a timeline for a book about the future? And then I wrote one so that it would be easier for our discussions about what needed to be added to make the world clearer. But so actually when I wrote the book, I knew in my body kind of when it was, but I didn't have an exact date or even an exact decade. I guess if you really sat me down, when I finally was forced to sit down and outline, I knew it was 30 years. But I still had to do this mathematical sort of equation that is so anathema to the writing process, at least for me. But yeah, I kind of wanted it simultaneously to feel close and yet far.
Right.
Because I think if it's closer, it feels scarier.
It does, and it's that there's no details that really alienate us from their experience, at least the experience they remember. And they don't really remember our experience here in the modern day. They don't remember the kind of abundance that we have now compared to what they have. They remember things have got a lot shabbier, even when they start remembering how things were before. Although, it's funny, Frida early on in the book remembers she's plagued by these dreams about getting lattes. And she thinks back to how nice it was, I guess, to be able to get a latte daily. This is long after lattes have disappeared, of course. By this time, they're living in a world without electricity, of course, or plumbing or anything like that. But people will read that and they'll, I think, try to say to themselves, I should really feel grateful for the latte that I have every day. But I realized you really can't be. You can be grateful for what is rare. And it's the same, the characters in the book, Frida and Cal, they're grateful when they get, they're grateful when they get a Band-Aid, right? Yeah. It's like, it's not possible to be grateful for a latte in the way that Frida in the 2050s is grateful for a latte, right?
Yeah. I mean, you're right. I do want people to stop and be like, oh, wouldn't it, imagine, because you're right, their life in LA, for instance, feels, I think, similar to ours, but shabbier is the right word. I mean, Frida remembers buying a single cloth napkin for herself when she's a teenager as a present, and that's like really special even then. But even so, Frida herself is slightly materialistic, I think, and she's not as responsible as somebody else might be. So even when the city's getting worse and worse and she should be hoarding things, she's still kind of blowing her money on lattes. But there are lattes still in the city, so things aren't that bad yet. Right. But I think you're right that what we have regularly, we can't long for. And that's kind of what I was playing with the book in her artifacts. So Frida has these objects that are very important to her, and one of them is that turkey baster, and that's a really valuable object to her because it's new and has never been used in a world where she has no new objects. And the same goes for Band-Aids, and for Cal, it's definitely books carry that because he hasn't seen a book you can hold in your hands and turn the pages since college, probably. Right. So that becomes extremely valuable and magical and powerful in a way that they are not in our everyday life.
And Cal, books are especially important to him because you have him having graduated from this sort of Deepsprings college-like place where like 12 guys for 2 years farm and then read philosophers and then farm and read philosophers. And this college, Planck, it becomes very, very important to the rest of the book. He's not the only one who went there. And it's no coincidence, in a sense, that the Planck lifestyle prepared Cal to live in the post-apocalyptic world. Do you have any experience with the types of people who go to these schools? I say these, I only really know of Deepsprings, but I mean, it's a type of education that exists.
It does. I read this great article by Dana Goodyear. Did you go to Deepsprings?
I didn't go to Deepsprings. Dana Goodyear was on this. The closest I can say is Dana Goodyear was on the show, but okay. Deepsprings, I did not go to Deepsprings. Like, did I strike you as a Deepsprings?
If you did go there. So I read this article about Deepsprings, and I sort of just became obsessed with the idea of this school. And I knew, even before I was even done with the article, that one day I was going to write something that was based on it. But I'm not a researcher. As a writer, I tend to get an idea and then just want to play pretend and fantasize about it. And if I know too much about something, I feel like it inhibits what I want to imagine for it. So I did look at the Deepsprings website and their application. And then it made sense that would work for my book, precisely because then Cal would be able to take Frida and help and survive in the middle of nowhere. He would have those skills. But it was equally important to me that it was a school that read a lot of philosophy and was extremely, heady and abstract. And I kind of like the idea of like white boys who just like are reading a lot and probably becoming assholes about it, but also idealizing that in other ways and kind of admiring that sort of life of the mind. Mm-hmm. But I went to Oberlin, which is a liberal arts college in Ohio. So and my husband went to the University of Chicago. So I kind of used some of his ways of his describing college and my own experience. And when I was in college, I was really into literary theory and lit crit. So kind of using that as the inspiration. And they're actually they're 2 long flashbacks from Planck that were in the book earlier that got cut during edits because everyone said they detracted from the story. But I hope one day maybe I need to write like a Planck spin-off novel. Because I had just there's a whole deleted scene that's, so Frida's brother Micah went to Planck as well. And that's how Cal knows Frida, through her brother Micah. Micah's the suicide bomber brother. There's a whole scene where Micah and Cal go to a brothel in Nevada. And that's how Cal loses his virginity. And I really love it. I mean, I don't know about I'm not saying like it's wonderfully written, but I learned a lot about Cal, and especially about Cal and Micah's relationship there that became important for me for later scenes in the book of kind of understanding character. So even though it got deleted, it was an essential scene for me to write. And it was just so fun to be at this Planck college, which is Deepsprings, but I don't really know what I've heard from actually, I think now 2 Deepsprings graduates.
Oh, really? Did they say you had it right?
One person said, he wrote me an email and he said, I'm a Deepsprings graduate. This has to be Deepsprings. How do you know so much about it? Which I felt like vindicated me because I was like, I just imagined almost everything. And a lot of it is Oberlin, like there's a part where Cal sees someone knocking on air, which is a sign of people showing agreement or support, but that's actually at Oberlin in the co-op system. When they have their like meetings, if people agree with you, they knock an invisible door, which I always found extremely annoying. So I was glad to put it
old in year 4.
Yeah. So I put it in the book. So there's there's a few gems for Oberlin students.
Now, as you say, Cal and Frida remember this life they had in Los Angeles where they still had lattes, but things were getting expensive or scarce and life was not what it once was. Life was no longer what it even is for us now. They leave, at Cal's suggestion, they leave Los Angeles to some part of California. How much do we know about where this is?
Now you're going to call me out.
How much does the reader know?
How much does the writer know, right? I originally, in a very early draft, they actually went to the Pacific Northwest, but then it didn't really make any sense. I was like, why are they up there? It's going to be too cold up there anyway. I have no idea where they are.
They're in California somewhere.
And they go north. So I consider, and there's a redwood or two. So they're sort of like in the Sequoia area. And a couple people really want to know the answer. And I mean, I grew up in LA and I barely knew where I was until I turned 16 and I was forced to learn the names of streets. So I'm just not a geographically inclined person anyway. But I also kind of think it doesn't matter because they're pretty much out in the sticks by themselves and they don't go, even when they finally go to find other settlers because Frida's pregnant, they're not going that far. So I kind of like the idea of, you know, it's sort of post-map almost because it doesn't really matter. If you're not really traveling, who cares where you are? So I was kind of liking that idea a little bit.
It's a setting about, makes me think about California's sort of uneasy relationship with nature. I mean, even here in Los Angeles, there's this sense that the city benefits from having so much nature around it, but it's also never been a really good relationship between nature and the city. Like there have been times when it's felt more threatening. I mean, we had a spate of sort of volcano erupting movies in the 1990s, or this idea that, you know, something we used to worry about earthquakes more than we do now, but is there some Californian relationship with nature that we've not quite come to terms with?
Probably. I mean, people ask me now if I'm a survivalist, and for the record, I'm wearing pink suede high heels. Sure. So the answer is no, definitively no. But I do think in LA in particular, I've read half of Ecology of Fear by Mark Davis, and actually I read this years ago and I had to put it down because it freaked me out too much, which I don't say that very often, but I will say that, I mean, that book was successful in like making me totally scared to live in LA. But apparently at the end of that book, a recent reader told me that there's a whole chapter dedicated to kind of LA apocalypses. And I think the landscape alone engenders that kind of anxiety because, I mean, I remember in elementary school I took like 3 field trips to the LA DWP to kind of learn about learn about water conservation and also to learn about how we get our water and the ways, and like the Joan Didion essay where she goes to the Hoover Dam, and just thinking about what it takes to make this city work. I mean, maybe we're not so crazy as those who live in Las Vegas or Phoenix or something, but
it could be worse.
It could be worse, but we still have to get all this water pumped in. And I mean, the drought situation here right now is really scary. And I think and then that water main busting recently, and just thinking like this pure gold just seeping out. And we have so many people, and it's really kind of terrifying. And then, you know, I think people really are scared of earthquakes, or we've learned not to think about it. I think we kind of coast on this. It's kind of like how people in LA are always like producing something, but what they're exactly producing is actually going to dissolve once they actually have to talk about it. So I think we sort of have to, there's a certain delusion that's required to live in LA because of the landscape is kind of unforgiving in all these ways, despite the fact that the weather is so perfect all the time.
Yeah, but we feel the earthquakes, they happen. They're just not very big usually. And there's nary a huge disaster you can point to in a long time in Los Angeles. That's the thing. Like it's psychological disaster. There's the Northridge earthquake, but
everything. I mean, that freeway. I remember the '94 earthquake so well, and I remember also how fast the 10 freeway that collapsed at La Cienega was fixed, as if it had never happened. Which is sort of how LA works in terms of revisionist history. And I mean, and LA is one of my favorite places, if not my favorite place on earth. So I'm speaking out of love for the city, but we tend to rebuild, and my favorite game when I come back to LA, because now I don't live here, sadly, is to kind of play what sad Russian mini mall was like raised to build something new. And a lot of times I can't even remember what was there before. So I have that
every day. I'm like, what was there? I don't. And if it could be 2 blocks from where I live, I guess.
Yeah, and there's that tour that some guy does where he takes you to old like places that used to exist in LA. So I think there's kind of a culture of forgetting a lot. And I think we play that up also in terms of like forgetting that there were these huge earthquakes, or that those huge, I mean, when I lived in Los Feliz in 2006, when those huge fires were going on in Griffith Park, I mean, we've kind of forgotten those too.
Yeah, there's a sense that you don't really notice the effects of these things, even when they happen sometimes. I think, say, you talked about the drought situation in California, and it's something I hear a lot about, but if I wasn't being told about it, I don't know if I would know there was a drought.
Yeah.
It's the same thing with the financial collapse. You know, it's talked, the terms it's talked about, and it's if this was the biggest thing to hit America since the Great Depression. But I don't know that I would have noticed it had I not been told about it.
Yeah.
And that's true of every bad thing almost that I hear about.
Yeah.
Things that are described in nearly apocalyptic terms as, signs of the coming apocalypse. I can't think of one that I felt.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Is there some sense that writing a novel like California, you're tapping into this, not desire, but fascination with, what if I actually felt an effect from one of these allegedly disastrous things happening in the world?
You put that, as beautifully put. I think that's true. And I think, as scary, one thing that led me to write the book was I was driving down Sunset and the streetlights had gone out and it was nighttime and it was really eerie. And I kept thinking, like, what if LA just didn't recover and there were no services and there were no streetlights and no roads, basically, no police force. And that's a reality for cities in America now. And thinking about what if that was a reality for LA and what would it require for that to happen? And as scary as that was in the moment, it was kind of a thrill to write. And I'm thinking about, like, Frida, I have her growing up basically where my dad lives, which is on, like Fairfax and Melrose, and she works at Cantor's.
Oh,
and she really has no real opportunities because the world's become the way it is. And, I think you're right that I wanted to really explore that fictive space because it's the threat of it all the time. And then there are places across the world where there's like grand austerity measures and people in their 20s are kind of loafing about at their parents' house. And, I wouldn't call it apocalyptic, but I'm sure on a personal level, it's really scary there, and uncertain. And I don't think that level of uncertainty has hit the majority of middle-class California.
Mm-hmm. Because it's a place that seems resilient to it, it makes it that much more appealing to try to see what if it wasn't so resilient.
Yeah, like what if LA's weather wasn't just beautiful all the time and everything worked out? Because even now when I think about the job, I'm like, it's going to rain. We are going to work on this. Everything will come together. It'll be fine. But, it might not.
Yeah, there's a sense like, why do we need rain? Can't we just pump it in somewhere else? Like it did it once before.
Chemicals.
Yeah, it's true. There's this way that because you write with you write a sort of gradual apocalypse, it feels like less of an apocalypse than just sort of a turning back the clock. This story of buying yourself a cloth napkin as a birthday present that could have come out of the Great Depression, or the farming they have to do, the farming that Cal tries to do, that could be out of the first agricultural age. Did you think of it all in terms of just turning the clock back rather than destroying things per se?
It's a good question. I definitely thought of it as the future. And thinking about mostly because the people doing those things are aware that they used to do it a different way. Mm-hmm. So I think that shift is what's difficult for them. But I do think that a lot of post-apocalyptic narratives that come about that are sort of post-technology are useful because they work in the way that, older novels do, for instance, where, it's easier. There's more mystery. There's more secrets because you can't just there's not easy answers and, there's not an easy way to connect. And I was also thinking about, there's a lot of the names in the book, of title of things are capitalized, like communities with a capital C, or the spikes with a capital S, or the land with a capital L. And I was definitely playing on that idea of kind of starting the world over. So, Frida and Cal have these neighbors, Sandy and Bo Miller, who they're dead before the book begins, and how they died is a mystery in the novel. But Sandy Miller, they have 2 children, and she says how her kids are going to start the world over. So there's a positive and kind of an optimistic way of looking at it, like, okay, well, the world has basically gone to shit, but we have the opportunity to start over from the beginning where, we can farm and and my husband says my book is like the most hipster book of all books because it's like artisanal everything. Right. It's the Brooklynization of the apocalypse, where you have an opportunity to have a tiny community where everyone's making everything from scratch and you're not going to waste anything and you can farm. And, there's an opportunity. There's a point where Frida, I think it's Frida, or maybe it's Cal, I don't remember at this point, who thinks about how they do this thing called thinking with a capital T, where they just lie down, close their eyes, and they ruminate on a single word. And I always think about in a slowed down life, that's kind of what you would do. That's kind of what you do at a writer's retreat, basically, of 10 hours to just lie on the couch and think if you wanted to. so that's sort of the positive way of it. But I was interested too in kind of the failure of that, of the failure of going back to ye olden times or going back to the beginning and starting over, because they don't do it well in the book. Turns out badly.
It seems like what we really want in the present day is some combination of old times and the future. Like nobody really wants to go back to having to think about growing food round the clock.
Yeah.
But
if you had the option.
yeah, I'm not quite sure. You know, I hadn't thought about this in the light of the sort of Brooklyn hipster point of view, but
I do think there is an anxiety about globalization, and maybe this is also something from technology where you're hearing everything and you're hearing about the world and at all moments, and yet you have no idea where your food came from. And there's like a real detachment from, you know, the food source and all that stuff. And I think people are growing weary of that. And so you see a return of like, you know, that phrase farm to table restaurant. I heard that every single city I went to on this book tour. The bookseller would be like, well, we have a farm to table restaurant down the street. And I'd be like, enough with the farm to table. But at the same time, I was happy to know that everything was locally sourced and they knew their farmers and they knew who made what. And I think that is a reaction against feeling powerless in kind of a global economy. And, you know, maybe this isn't like a post 2008 recession of people feeling that real fear of like, the global economy does not care about me and I'm just kind of a pawn on it. So can I in some way, because you can't completely divest yourself of it, but can I in some way kind of enact some power through interacting with real humans? So maybe that's part of it. Or maybe that's just bullshit.
It seems correct, and it also seems equally correct that when a country is very well integrated with other countries in the global economy, they have less of a chance of turning apocalyptic in a way. You know, if we think of apocalypse scenarios, they tend to be inside countries that are not very well globalized, you know, the Hades of the world. It couldn't have hurt them to be better integrated to the world as a whole. So it's sort of, you never really gain any ground on this, do you? You have something to be insecure about no matter what, right?
It's true. Definitely. And something I thought of in the book was, you know, maybe because Frida and Keller are so isolated, I was sort of imagining this was like the fall of the American Empire. And so maybe across the world in another country like India, things are great.
Could be.
You know? And I thought it actually scarier to think about, you know, the world isn't over if you have money. I think that's a really horrifying thought. And it's in some ways true. I mean, there are poor people in a number of countries in the Middle East, for instance, or Africa that, you know, they're screwed. But, you know, we can have lattes here.
Right. It's like it's this concept you have of the communities, which are, I suppose, we would think of them as like gated communities within this ruined California, and life in them isn't great as you describe it, but it's at least safe. Safety has become, nothing is valuable but safety, it seems like, in this world. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's definitely a commodity that the communities are selling, and you can't get into a community unless you have money, and also you have to be kind of vetted, and you know how people get into them is kind of mysterious, but they have to keep them a certain size, and some cost more but are much smaller, so you can kind of maintain, you know, exclusivity and, you know, making sure that you're protected. And that comes from, my sister actually lives in Orange County, and she is not in a gated community, but she lives by a few. Yeah. And I find them really creepy. I always thought they were creepy. And I find her neighborhood kind of creepy in that it's so perfect seeming. Like you know, they pay some money to be part of this community. So it's not gated. Anyone can drive up or whatever, but they have like a community pool, and there's like beautiful flowers. Everything's trimmed nicely, and like, your house has to be painted in a certain palette, you know. I mean, it's a great place to grow up. I suppose that's what you hear, and the schools are good. They're public schools, but I find there's something shadowy underneath, to me. But I mean, maybe I just like read too much, you know, like John Cheever. But I also was interested in a community in the future where it would seem great, but in one of the communities, Pines, like, the lights turn off at random times. The future's coming for them too.
It reminds me of something I heard somebody say about the Soviet Union, which was that it fell, yes, for economic reasons, but also it had been decades since those societies had given their people a reason to live. It sounds like in the communities in the world of California, they're concerned with safety. No one really has a reason to live in them. There is another example provided of life in this post-apocalyptic state, which is another, not a capital C community, but a regular C community called the Land, which has been, how would you describe it? It is certainly not a capital C community, but it is an organization. It's a group of people trying to figure out another way to live here in this reality, is it not?
Yeah, I mean, what's funny is it's so obvious, but I didn't intend it until I was about halfway through, where the land and the communities with a capital C are very similar. So they're an organized group of people that are exclusive, and the land believes in containment. That's like their tagline. And they are organized around, a core set of principles of like what they believe. And you have to read to find out what it is. But on the one hand, and I think you could argue the same for the communities with a capital C, is that it's just a group of people who are trying to get by and trying to find the best way forward in a world that's just seriously depleted. So on the land, they have settled in a ghost town that it was a real actual ghost town that then became like a theme park that then was abandoned again. So it's a ghost town of a ghost town. So they have the benefit of a place with buildings to live, but it's kind of a cooperative society, and it has a lot of idealistic principles, and they're working together, and it seems really great, and you're like, well, why wouldn't you want to live here? But then there is sort of the nefarious elements of it as well. Because I think any community that requires rules of its people to a stronger degree has some issues. And it won't let itself like organically grow into various sizes. That's questionable to me as well.
There's these challenges that the groups have in this ruined America, but the challenges the individuals have, I mean, getting food, not being hungry, not getting diseases, reproducing if possible, finding shelter, finding security. I mean, are these problems different in kind from our problems in reality, or just different in degree?
Well, I like to say that Frida and Cal in the book, they're like a regular married couple to me. What I was after was writing a domestic drama that just happened to take place in the future. So even though, they have to deal with I think their problems are definitely different from a regular couple's in terms of like our feet there's fungus going on. Yes, that's probably a problem in some couples, but probably not most. You just go out and buy some special soap and you're okay. Yes. Or will we eat, or what if there's some freak storm and then we're really screwed and we're really the only ones. And thinking about, people might live in a small town and not see a lot of other people or go on vacation with just their partner, but it's really the Frida and Cal show all the time. And I was thinking about what pressure that would exert on their dynamic and how that dynamic because to me, they can spend they're a kind of couple that can spend a lot of time together, and they're very different, but they sort of complement each other. And if anyone could do it, they could do it. So I was thinking about the ways that their dynamic functions successfully, and the way that dynamic is threatened when it's not just the two of them. Because I find it really intriguing when you're with somebody for a long time and then a third person comes in, or a fourth person, and suddenly it's better in some ways, it's worse in other ways. So I was just thinking that on a really, truly just interpersonal level. But I think a lot of their problems are I think Frida and Cal would be the same whether they were in the 2050s or in 2014. And it seems to me that sometimes that pisses people off when they read the book. Some people really connect with that idea. It's interesting. I kind of love readerly diversity, I guess. But it seems to me some people are like, why are they being so secretive and immature and petty and da-da-da-da? And some people are like, this feels really realistic, and, we think that we would be these better people in these exceptional circumstances, but maybe we wouldn't. Maybe we would become more ourselves. And I always make this joke, like, if my husband and I, we get along very well. We don't bicker really or anything. But if we can't find a parking spot in a stressful situation and it's not the end of the world, I mean, imagine what bad stuff might emerge from us if it really were the end of the world.
Yeah, I think it's a question a lot of readers will put to themselves reading this book. What would I do under these circumstances? But to me, there was a question sort of above that one, which was, how far do circumstances have to change before it's not me anymore? I mean, I could envision, you could say, what's it like? What would it be like if I had to live without power and plumbing? Okay. Or what would it be like if I had to live without an arm or something like that? It's still you, but as you change things enough, it's not you anymore, is it? I mean, this is the question, you know, a white male like myself will often get asked, well, imagine if you were black or a woman or so on. And I think, well, okay, but that's not, at that point, it's not me. I mean, you realize that's someone else at that point.
Where does the you begin and end,
exactly.
I suppose.
So at some point, I mean, can apocalyptic conditions mean you're talking effectively about somebody else or not?
That's a really good question. I mean, at the end of the book, I really do want people to think about how much they have changed. Are they still themselves? And by that point, I mean, they've already lived through the apocalypse, quote unquote. It's sort of a personal apocalypse that happens in the second half of the book. So are they, in fact, themselves at the end of the novel? I mean, sometimes it's interesting because sometimes readers really connect with Frida and Cal, and there's been a few readers who really hate some readers hate Frida in a very specific way. And I like to say, well, I think she's supremely flawed and realistic, but she frustrates me to no end at times. But I also think, you know, this is a person who, you know, she was kind of born into an LA that was fraying around the edges and then got worse and worse. And she really didn't have opportunities to mature in the ways that people in their early, 18 to 22 might mature in previous generations. And then her brother was a suicide bomber and kind of wrecked her family. And then she went to live in the middle of nowhere, and she's not a survivalist. She's someone who is an urban kid who had to learn to do all this stuff. And she's been around the same person for the last 2 years. I'm like, how that would change your psyche and change your behavior. I mean, I can't even imagine what kind of person I would be after all of those, situation. So I tend to cut her some slack and feel affectionate towards her because I feel like, considering all that she's been through, there's a core of her that I can imagine she was born with and that she kind of carries with her throughout the book, that she doesn't really, there's a light that never goes out, I suppose. But you're right. I mean, what gets molded based on such extreme situations? That's the question.
Yeah. Change the context enough and it's like there's a lot of pitfalls I'm sure you thought about avoiding when you write a post-apocalyptic novel, because you go into that tradition and there's quite a few duds. Yes, and it's like writing a time travel book. It's hard to write a good time travel book, and that's another one. You change the era somebody's in. It's like somebody asking, "What if you were born 100 years before?" Well, then it wouldn't be me. It's the same. It's the same thing. You change conditions enough, you change who the characters are, but I do want to get a sense of how much, ultimately, by the end of this book, you thought you were writing in this realm of post-apocalyptic novels. Maybe at the beginning you thought it, but by the end of it, had it separated from that for you?
What do you mean?
Because, you start out writing this setting that, okay, clearly America's been ruined already. What would this be like? But by the end, in your actual writing process, you're not... as you say, you're thinking about it more as a domestic drama at a certain point. By the end, were you thinking about it as either of those things? What had the novel sort of separated itself from all traditions for you by the end of it?
Yeah, I mean, I often get this question about why did I write a dystopia? What am I interested in the apocalypse genre? And to be honest, because I was so ignorant of the genre, as I said, and because I was just really interested in the couple, that I really felt, and I'm sure that everybody feels this way, and falsely, and you kind of need to feel this way to write, that I felt like I had set out on my own and that there were no other books that were doing what I was doing, which I recognize is not true. But I think when any writer starts out on a project, you have to kind of embark with that delusion. And I think just the muck of writing, of thinking about paragraphs and character arcs and, really trying to deeply see a scene and feel like you're inhabiting another person's consciousness, that kind of takes precedence over all other intentions in terms of genre or domestic drama. It's funny, there's a lot of world building at the beginning of the book, and there's a lot of world building in the final 2 chapters of the book. But in between, I feel like there's just a bunch of people out in the woods. So that could, in some ways, take place anytime. And so that didn't feel quite post-apocalyptic or speculative.
This apocalypse, in any case, follows on from, as you say, a Los Angeles that is fraying at the edges and soon becomes uninhabitably dangerous. I feel like people for a long time have been describing Los Angeles as fraying and it's so dangerous. And even when it's clearly not true, there's some sense of like, obviously Los Angeles is terribly broken. Obviously it's getting worse all the time, but it's just like a meme. I mean, I don't know what's been your reaction to that. It's been in the conversation as long as I can remember. It's probably been in the conversation since the 60s or 70s that Los Angeles is this mess of a place that's always getting messier. Why do we need to think that?
Yeah. You know, it's funny. I actually don't. I think in the last 5 years or so, it's gotten a lot better.
True. I mean, talking about reality and such, we still like our ruined Los Angeles as in fiction.
I think we like feed off of it. But I mean, of course, I think every major city lately has done a really good job of pushing out the poor so that you're like, I don't see the poor. I mean, there's some cities.
We still have Skid Row here.
Yeah, I know, but I think we've done. I mean, reprehensibly. I had a friend who worked on like the homeless problem here and did the homeless count. But I think it's easy to be blind of that because of the way that the city is built, so that the poor people are getting pushed farther and farther out of LA city limits. So you could sort of feel like, and there's so much money in LA, and every time I come back, I feel it, and I'm kind of struck by it. But LA to me seems to be getting better. There's more public transportation. It seems like culturally LA is getting better and better with every year. I think the speed of development in LA and the population in LA feels untenable to me at times, where I'm like, we really all can't be here right now. Really, like it just, so that seems to be an anxiety for me. But I feel like the pendulum has swung in recent years to the sort of LA was shitty, but now it's getting better. Actually, it was funny. Yesterday at a San Francisco reading, somebody made a comment that LA was this cultural wasteland. And I was thinking how I hadn't really heard that cliche in so long, not only from Angelenos, but
is it 1960?
Yeah, even in New York, I feel like I don't hear that anymore. I hear everybody saying, "Oh, LA is so wonderful. I love to go to LA, and the bookstores are great, and the museums, and the concert hall." So it seems to me that we still hold on to the apocalyptic card, but as far as realistic appraisal of LA, it seems to be mostly positive nowadays, unless I'm just...
I think it is. And you mentioned that idea where we can't all be here, can we? I feel like there's not that many people here. I mean, if you really break it down, I just came back from Seoul where there's 25 million people in the same area, and it doesn't feel like uninhabitable, but to me, I mean, California, the state, not the novel, it doesn't have that many people in it. I mean, it's got less than 40 million people. And I mean, yeah, it's got more people than Canada, but for all its cultural cachet, California, sometimes it seems like there's almost nobody here. You know what I mean?
I guess it's a state. I'm thinking like my dad some old neighbor of ours gave us this video it was like 1985, and he gave it to us because there's a part where I'm in it. It's from his birthday party. But there's a part before that where the guy doing the video just drove down Melrose with his camera. And it looks like a one-horse town. And that's not even that long ago. And just to think about the amount of development that's happening and the kind of the building and the rebuilding, and obviously compared to Seoul, it looks paltry, right?
Uninhabited sometimes.
Yeah, and I mean, California as a whole, I mean, when you drive across California, it's like nobody. Yeah. Hello. Yes. There's just those cows on the 5, right? And that's it. I don't know. It's a good question. I mean, it's funny. I was thinking, I was just driving, this is sort of off topic, but I was driving in the South for some of my readings, and I was thinking about how green and lush and beautiful it was. And there were really no people around. And I was thinking, well, that's why there are people who suggest that climate change is a fiction or a myth, because it's so beautiful here. You could not even imagine that, humans are ruining the world.
Right. It just comes back to the sense of the way our ideas about what's wrong with the world, what's wrong with California, what's wrong with our city, never quite align with what might actually be wrong with it. I mean, the sense that California has too many people in it, I mean, it's... Come on. It's not... Well, that's one thing. I mean, this is what I'm getting to. It can seem... We have good ways of making it seem like certain things are the problem, when certain other things might actually be the problem. We might live in ways where we individually take up a lot of space, and that might make it seem like population is the issue, when in fact something else is the problem, right?
You're probably right. And I don't pretend to know really what's wrong with California.
Yeah, maybe nothing is. I don't know.
Perfect. Everything's perfect. It's going well.
It's one of those things. How can we really know?
We got rid of our deficit, didn't we? The budget's looking good. We're fine. Everything's fine.
something else that they touch on, that the character touch on in the novel, is that you never really know you're safe.
Yeah.
But you don't know that in the abundant, the sort of abundant present either, right? I mean, safety is one of those things that you sort of decide you have it or you don't, right? It's more psychological than anything.
I think that's kind of the definition of terrorism, of suddenly being afraid to fly in an airplane. And I remember very early on, like, it might even been before September 11th or right after, my husband, who was my boyfriend at the time, he said something like, real terrorism will happen when you'll be afraid to go to a restaurant because you'll be afraid someone will blow themselves up. And that obviously stuck with me because I put it in my book. Yeah. But I think there is sort of an illusion of safety that that's what's so scary about, people coming with guns into a movie theater, where there's no security at movie theaters. And yet you just assume that everyone is adhering to the same contract of how we exist in public space. There is an essay also by Jonathan Franzen in How to Be Alone about, it's a question about somehow this relates for me, but the question of public versus private, and that he was more concerned with people, not so much the public, the government entering private spaces, but the idea that the private was entering public space. So things like people having serious conversations in public on their cell phones was deeply wounding to him and kind of alarming. But I think there's something similar there in terms of, like, we have an illusion. You have created an illusion of privacy for yourself that does not exist, or you have kind of an illusion of how we should behave in public space. That is also just an illusion.
Right. When people enter the world of California, the novel, they long as much for their illusions as they long for the actual things that they miss. I mean, even when they get to a form of society, Frida starts thinking about, remember how I felt when it was just me and Cal. She thinks back to just sort of what her perception was. You're always kind of inventing your own perceptions of how the past was as you go. I mean, this happens in America, doesn't it? You think, remember how we were all feeling really prosperous in the 90s or 50s or whatever? Were we? I don't know. Like, I don't know.
I know. Now it's funny because, I wasn't alive. We weren't alive in the 50s, and yes. I kind of imagined this sort of Norman Rockwell sort of, but that actually, in fact, was not.
Yes. I mean, were those the communities of their day, capital C?
Oh, probably, right. But I also thinking about, in the flashbacks that I have in the book, for instance, Cal thinking about college, it's a very double-sided memory. On the one hand, he really values it in this way that it was sort of the best time of his life. And yet there's a darkness at the edges because he remembers how Micah was like. And later in the book, he comes to see Plank in a different way, that he had never really allowed himself to imagine that his alma mater could be anything but pure. So kind of playing with that a little bit.
Do you have some specific interest in how closed societies shape your perceptions of things, be it a Deepsprings college, be it Oberlin, be it a community? I mean, this seems to come up as a theme in your book and in the conversation. The way your thinking changes when you just get into a closed circle like that.
I guess so. I always say that my fiction that I usually write is people talking in rooms.
Got to talk somewhere.
Really, and it's dramatic, right? Rooms. But I mean, a room is an enclosed space where you have this sort of notion of transgression could occur because it's an enclosed space. So I guess in general, I am on a sort of broader level interested in that. And it's funny, like I said, I didn't think too hard I kind of write intuitively. I don't know where I'm going when I'm writing. And so the themes and the motifs kind of come to being. And some of them are so obvious that if I had done it on purpose, it would be almost silly. But I guess I am kind of interested in that, in the ways, and I'm interested in, like, this question, like you said, like, are you the same person if all these things change? So are you the same person with how you change depending on who's around and what the societal and kind of social pressures are?
I threw this out just casually earlier, but do you think each era has its own brand of apocalypse?
Oh, for sure, I think. I think everybody thinks the world is ending all the time.
Yes.
I just think that we're probably right. I know. I mean, I do think, right? I mean, I suppose, we think about, like, post-World War II and this kind of the baby boom generation, you know, and that the thrill of being alive after a war that they didn't. I mean, we're told that historically they did not believe it was the end of the world, but somebody must have been ready for the shoe to drop.
Yes, someone's always ready.
Yeah, right. But and then then we get into the Cold War, and that's sort of like the antagonist, the unknown antagonist or the known one. So that's always been present. I don't know. I get this question all the time now to kind of speak about our human instinct for doom, but I don't ever know what to say because I'm like, I have it, but I'm also kind of a sunny person at the same time. So I just assume that everybody else has it too.
And you seem to operate on the premise that when everything ends, everything doesn't end.
Yeah,
I mean, that's the whole. That could be that could be the tagline for this novel, couldn't it?
Good for the movie poster. But it's true. That's, I think, what's scariest is to think like, if a nuclear blast occurs and we're all this, like, LA is flattened, well, then we're flattened and people will mourn us on Facebook in New York or whatever.
Sure.
But we won't have to, like, emerge from the swamp, right? But I think it's actually scarier for things to just get worse and worse and you keep waking up. I mean, isn't that why grief is so horrible? Somebody died and you have to live and continue to live in that pain that does not go away. It only changes. I haven't actually deeply grieved anyone, but everyone I know who grieves, that's sort of what comes up for me a lot when they're like, that's the kind of common theme that I pick up on, is that sense of loss just being transformed day to day and never really disappearing. And that's the pain of it. So I guess that's what I'm interested in writing about.
The way that it's not the ending, it's whatever comes after the ending.
Yeah,
that's where you start.
Exactly. Like all good tragedies.
And it's the way that this novel, California, starts by our guest today on the Los Angeles Review of Books podcast, Edan Lepucki. She is a staff writer at The Millions. She is also the founder of Los Angeles Writing Workshops. She is the author, as I say, of California, brand new. It's a novel that is very much tapping into the apocalyptic fantasies, dreads of today. Edan, thanks so much.
Thank you for having me.
This has been the Los Angeles Review of Books podcast. I've been Colin Marshall. You can keep up with me at colinmarshall.org or with the LARB at lareviewofbooks.com. Thanks.